Part 5, What is the ego? I said earlier that the ego is the element of the individual psyche responsible for adaptation to the external and internal environment. But what is the ego? To answer this question, we can refer to Freud and Jung and show some differences between their theories. Although they both agreed on the general dynamic nature of the regulation of the psyche, Jung seemed to pay more attention to the qualitative aspect of mental processes, and Freud to the quantitative aspects. They also had a different understanding of the idea of the sexual drive, libido, underlying psychological processes and phenomena. They described in a different way the structure of the psyche and its properties. Freud emphasized the dynamic axis of the regulation of drives, id ego superego, while Jung treated the unconscious level of the psyche as a separate being or personality, a separate unconscious subject guided not only by the primal impulses but also by its own wisdom, using its own language. From the perspective of the topographic and structural model of the mind, the concepts of these two psychologists do not differ much. Both locate the consciousness and ego/I between the outside world and the unconscious sphere, but they differ in terms of the assumed components of the unconscious. For example, according to Freud and Jung, the ego/I emerged from the unconscious. In Freud's understanding, however, this matter was the unconscious id, ger. Das es, eng. It, according to Jung, it was simply the unconscious, or from a different perspective, from the self. The I appeared as a result of the contact of the psyche with the world and the further gradual differentiation of its structures. Both Freud and Jung emphasized that the appearance of the I is directly related to the perception of both internal and bodily stimuli, as well as stimuli coming from outside the organism. Freud argued that the I is the nucleus of the perception process and that perceptions are to him what unconscious drives are to the id. The self-perception of the body is, to him, constitutional to such an extent that Freud even stated that the I is a projection of the surface of the body. In his works from different periods, he added other descriptions. For example, he said that the I/ego is, to some extent, preconscious and even merges with the id, and that it contains certain elements that usually remain unconscious. On the other hand, Jung, considering the nature of the I and its relation to consciousness, wrote, "What do we mean by the ego? For all its appearance of unity, it is obviously a highly composite factor. It is made up of images recorded from the sense functions that transmit stimuli both from within and from without, and furthermore of an immense accumulation of images of past processes. All these multifarious components need a powerful cohesive force to hold them together, and this we have already recognized as a property of consciousness. Consciousness therefore seems to be the necessary precondition for the ego. Yet without the ego, consciousness is unthinkable." This apparent contradiction may perhaps be resolved by regarding the ego, too, as a reflection not of one but of very many processes and their interplay, in fact, of all those processes and contents that make up ego consciousness. Their diversity does indeed form a unity, because their relation to consciousness acts as a sort of gravitational force drawing the various parts together, towards what might be called a virtual center. For this reason I do not speak simply of the ego, but of an ego complex, on the proven assumption that the ego, having a fluctuating composition, is changeable and therefore cannot be simply the ego. Jung, Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, 1970. As you can see, Jung's statement is in part close to Freud's point of view. However, he omits in the description the functions that would result either 1. From the three-stage structure of the mental apparatus adopted by Freud, based on the id-ego-superego axis, or 2. From the mechanism of balancing between the sphere of id drives and the requirements of surroundings. Jung emphasizes the structural aspect of the I structure, as well as the role of cognitive processes in its constitution. Just as Freud considers the I to be the pivotal element for consciousness, being the subject of all personal acts of consciousness, he nevertheless places them in the field of consciousness, stressing that the direct relation of a given content to it is the main criterion for its awareness. Without the I, no content can be realized. Part 6, Jung's and Damasio's theory of the ego/self. The Jungian model of the psyche is very rich and useful, but I'd like to develop it further. I'd like to additionally increase our ability to understand our ego and consciousness. That's why I want to reach for the theory of neurologist Antonio Damasio. In his books, this Portuguese-American neuroscientist explored how a brain creates an individual self. This self is understood in a different way. It replaces the Freudian or Jungian concept of egos differentiating additional levels of consciousness. Damasio distinguished in his work three main components of the conscious experience. The first level of it is a proto-self, we can call it in Jungian terms a proto-ego. On a foundation of the proto-self is then founded the second level of the conscious mind, a so-called core self. On the third and highest level is the autobiographical self. In his theory, Damasio describes how non-conscious neural signaling of an individual organism creates a proto-self, which next permits further a core self and a core consciousness. This, subsequently, allows an autobiographical self which permits our extended conscious experience. At the end of this chain of processes, the extended consciousness permits our self-awareness and all higher mental processes. Damasio, The Feeling of What Happens, 2000. The proto-self is a biological precursor of the higher forms of your psychological being. It is essentially an unconscious representation of your body. These processes are involved in maintaining a proper condition of our body, an appropriate level of its functioning, stability, and functional efficiency that guarantees survival. This unconscious and constantly generated representation that is mapping the internal states of our organism in its basic aspect is just a set of innate mechanisms of the brain whose primary task is to manage the body's vital functions, including chemical and hormonal regulation, coordinating the movements of the internal organs. Its key ingredient, as well as the tool, is called neural maps in the brain. The function of reflectivity is the main dimension of the proto-self, which becomes the foundation and the material for the creation of new forms of conscious mental life. The next level described by Damasio is a core consciousness, core self. It's the consciousness that is different from the state of wakefulness or the phenomenon of attention and gives you a feeling of being here and now. Damasio describes that kind of consciousness as the highest level of biological functions of the organism. But paradoxically, it also has a clear psychological dimension due to this level containing such mental processes as the integrated field of perception and self-perception that are already non-biological functions of mental life. In contrast to the next, higher level of expanded, wider consciousness, this phenomenon has only one dimension of the organization, but in contrast to wider consciousness, in ordinary circumstances, it is always present and stable throughout the entire life. There are of course some exceptions to this rule, for instance, epileptic automatism when someone is awake but does not have the feeling of the I. The core consciousness is associated with the core self. It does not depend on your long-term memory or on reasoning or language. The key to this level of consciousness is the concept of a mental image or neural structure, pattern, that is a mental pattern in any sensory modality. These structures are collected in a coherent whole in the coordinated adaptive actions of your organism. The main regulative mechanism is homeostasis. These mental images may reflect any of the objects or phenomena, external and internal. They are directly associated with the relationships between your organism and your psyche, between the external and internal environment. The key point here is the relationship, human mind, the external and cognitive representation internal objects. The level of core consciousness is associated with 1. The integration of your perception and 2. The phenomenon, experienced by us, of internal move in the brain flowing in our mind and 3. The phenomenon, experienced by us, of qualities perceived by our senses, the so-called qualia. But still, this level has neither a past nor a future quality/dimension. And all past experiences are present only in a rudimentary form of memory traces that are emerging from the subjects here and now. On a higher level of extended consciousness, all the features are already present. According to Damasio, expanded consciousness has many aspects and subdimensions. It is responsible not only for the experience of a sense of individual identity, the extensive, wider, deeper experience of being a person, but also in a historical, sociological, psychological, etc. context. The extended consciousness is associated not only with the functioning of memory but also with the ability to reason logically and the generating and processing of the complex structures of meanings, including the matter of language with its elements, vocabulary, and its structures, grammar. The expanded consciousness enables us to have a multidimensional experience of ourselves and of the external world. Both of these types of consciousness are related with the two kinds of a self, the core self and the autobiographical self. The second of these selves can be related to the traditional understanding of the self associated to a sense of individual identity and being a unique person with their own history of life. I would add, however, that in my opinion, Damasio's understanding of the term autobiographical self relies too heavily on a time-orientated and identity-orientated perspective. That is why at this point I would suggest another term in order to gain a better description of this phenomenon. I suggest the concept of the understanding self, that is, the self that is directly related with and founded on complex mental processes, on the understanding of ourselves and the world. This self is fully shaped in an adult human, but it still develops itself through a whole life by incorporating, gradually every day, further and further perspectives of understanding of the world and one's existence. This is confined not only to the autobiographical aspects but to a whole range of meanings that emerge from the activity of the brain itself, for instance, the abstract aspects of being in the world. When we look at all living beings from this perspective, we realize that the main criterion of accurate differentiation of the level of conscious experience in living creatures will be the level of their understanding of themselves and the world. It will not be the criterion of establishing their existence in the autobiographical or historical perspective. The ability to acquire language and to perform semantic marking of the objects in the world, or, in other words, the semantic differentiation and organization of the subjective experience is one of the key elements defining the psychological development of the subject and also determines an experience of the consciousness. Of course, the language here is not the only dimension that guides and determines the direction of the mental development of individuality. But as each acquired new function is integrated during the development of a child, it affects further development and functioning. Language is in a significant way an instrument of nature which stimulates and directs further development of the living organisms in which it appears or emerges. Now let us integrate the aforementioned two theories. The proto-ego/I would include all first-level mapping structures of the organism with its functions. That level would be closely related to the area of unconsciousness, especially in its biological dimension. The core ego/I would be involved in the building of a conscious here and now experience on all its levels and in all its aspects. But here, you can also locate the first unconscious or preconscious influences of the archetypes and collective unconsciousness, especially when we think of them from the perspective of the shaping power of archetypal images or instinctual patterns of behavior. Here we can also locate some of the consequences of activity of the psychoid dimension of the psyche and the matter, here, your organism. Lastly, on this level, you can locate some influences of the archetype of the self understood as the unconscious factor but acting and influencing your conscious states of mind. But the hypothetical functions of the mind that are associated with the Jungian concept of the self should not be understood only as the functions that operate on a level of the core consciousness, because we can assume as well that they are present on a higher level of processing information, on the level of mature reasoning, and on a level of the highest insights. In that perspective, we look at the higher level of brain functioning not only from the perspective of its manifesting as a conscious being, but the unconscious too. This means that your higher mental functioning has continuously present two sets of functions. 1. The functions associated with your field of consciousness or the conscious I, and 2. Those functions which operate from out of that field, to which the conscious I has no access. Your unconscious processes of the higher level can be interpreted here as the adaptive functions related to the higher but unconscious subject, the self. From that perspective, we can differentiate further the Jungian theory of the conscious and preconscious mind, especially the Jungian and psychoanalytical theory of ego/I. To accomplish it we are using here the theory of Antonio Damasio. In this new perspective the mind consists of the following functional levels. 1. The conscious understanding self. 2. The semi-conscious core self. 3. The non-conscious or semi-conscious proto-self. 4. The totally unconscious mind, also including the self understood from a Jungian perspective, with its archetypal metaphysical foundation.